All right. Welcome back, everyone, to the main stage. Hopefully everyone got a good quick break, made it over to the exhibit hall. And again, as another reminder, please get over to the exhibit hall, speak to our amazing leaders and companies in our industry. Right now, we're going to have a conversation with 3 Ethereum architects. So we're excited about that. We're bringing up leaders from JP Morgan. We're bringing Accenture and Web3 Labs. So I will hand it over to Ken Fromm of EEA. He will moderate this session. So take it away, guys.
Great. Thank you all. And glad to have you all join us here. So why don't you go first through and introduce yourselves, your titles and your companies.
Yeah, I'll go first. So I am Sudhir Upadhyay. I head the engineering team at Onyx by JP Morgan. And I've been with JP Morgan for some time. And prior to that, I used to work for a Silicon Valley startup before I joined JP Morgan.
Great. Conor?
Hi, everyone. I'm Conor Svensson, founder and CEO of Web3 Labs. Web3 Labs is a blockchain technology company. We work with companies on Web3 strategy and also delivery. And we have a couple of products, Web3J, the JVM and Android integration library for Ethereum, and the Ethereum Blockchain Explorer.
Great. Sushil?
Hi, so my name is Sushil. I have been with Accenture from the last 7 years. In the blockchain space, I have been, I think, for more than 5 years now, and mostly I have been helping clients in designing and implementing blockchain solutions.
Great, thanks. Okay, so let's go first. Let's dive right into it, and let's talk about the networks and the components and the stacks that you're using. So, Sudhir, do you want to open up and brief of the project that you might be working on, and also sort of the networks? I think that's what people probably have a lot of questions as to. Where do I start? What do I choose? What networks?
Absolutely. So the key project that we are working right now is around asset tokenization. And asset tokenization is not foreign to most of us. And in fact, many of us are quite familiar with that. The really difference for us is asset tokenization in enterprises and how do we manage those. And in some cases, in enterprises, it's a lot more easier, but in other cases, it's a lot more challenging than some of the public implementations and so forth. The key stack that we use is Quorum. Many of you may know Quorum is a fork of Ethereum by JP Morgan, which is not owned by Consensus. We use a permissioned private network where only identified KYC participants can join, and participation is by invite only. We manage that permissioning from a network operations perspective, and all of our tokenization occurs on that particular network, where different participants, mostly institutions, can interact and exchange exchange tokenized assets using some of the existing, well-known smart contract, definitions and so forth.
Okay, great. Hey, Conor, do you want me to bring up that slide that you had earlier on the permission? Do you want to kind of talk through that maybe and explain some of the decision making you have when you're talking about networks?
Sure. Thanks, Ken. So I think certainly because we work with a number of different organizations, and we've been doing this for years now as well. And our default stack certainly has always been Ethereum based, insofar as typically we start with clients with private permission networks, or we have done, because of the fact that it's kind of like a ring-fenced environment. If you saw Jason Anderson's talk about Quorum blockchain service earlier on, that I think is really articulates some of the advantages and so on with that approach. But there's certainly been a trend over the last few years that we've seen, and this is around this idea of moving, in some cases, away from the private permission models, ultimately towards public permissionless models. And so if we look at this kind of the graphic here, it kind of shows how these blockchain networks can be deployed there. And in these sort of earlier days, the private permission networks, this sort of ring fence model, it's certainly been very appealing. But there's challenges that come with governing these sorts of networks at scale, and also I think what we certainly see in enterprises too is that for some initiatives there are some that are going incredibly well. I think the work that JP Morgan's one such example, but also when you see what companies like Finality are doing and so on, that's they're great use cases and that works. But there's a lot there too where it actually kind of makes more sense to move towards the public and permissionless networks. But there's a big caveat there, and that's around the privacy and identity challenges that organizations face. And this is where initiatives like the Baseline Protocol are very helpful insofar as creating really the kind of enterprise grade encryption and focusing on areas like identity to address that.
Okay, great, fantastic. Let's go over then to Sushil, and why don't you explain your project and some of the network aspects that you're employing.
Sure. So I'm going to talk about a project that we have been doing with Microsoft from quite some time. So it's a hardware supply chain track and trace solution. And this project is going on with Microsoft and quite a bunch of its suppliers. And the intention is to create digital twin of the assets and track it across the supply chain. Now, in our case also, it's a private permissioned network. We are using Go-Quorum as the underlying blockchain protocol. And because it's a private network, any member only who gets the invite, he or that member is about, he can join the network. All right. And apart from Go-Quorum, I think we are using quite some other components also. For example, IPFS for the off-chain data storage, which is tightly linked to Go-Quorum. And the entire application is built on the Azure stack to make it scalable for the cloud, right? And I think a new member who comes or who wants to come in the network, they get two options. Either they can download the stack from the marketplace, the Azure marketplace, and then we complete, that is also by invitation, and then we complete the networking piece, or they can do a deployment using our scripts also. But the bottom line is it's a private permissioned network, and you get to join only via invitation.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk maybe about some of the smart contracts. Anyone want to jump in terms of like how many smart contracts they have? What are some of the key ones? Give people an idea of what the number and the scope of these that drive some of your implementations.
Yeah, I can go.
Sure.
Yeah, all right. So I didn't want to jump in every skill. Yeah. So and before I go into the smart number of smart contracts and so forth, right? I think the key thing I wanted to highlight was the business process and the flows, right? And in some cases, our implementation of the smart contract is not a lot more from a principle and best practices perspective is not significantly different than existing emerging technology, traditional software practices, right? Where we keep the functional areas different, or functional aspects decoupled from the assets, assets being the actual financial instruments, be it cash, loans, FX, swaps, anything, or exotic ones as well. So keeping that in mind, we keep our assets tokens, or asset smart contract is one, and then following the model of a generic trade flow, where you have an asset, you have a trade flow, and then you have a post settlement of the trades and so forth, right? And then that's how we split our, typically our some of the smart contract layer. And given that flow, we consistently follow a practice where leverage and reuse a number of the generic trade flow across different assets. So that keeps our number lower. At the same time, keeps the minimalistic logic on the chain and keeping a lot of the logic off chain. And as we all know, Solidity at the moment is still to mature in some sense, and that helps us. So going back to the final question you have, I would say for a typical project size of one asset tokenization, tokenizing one single asset, we're probably talking about at least a dozen of smart contracts, and that combines your trade flow, your assets, and some of the post settlement as well. But the numbers can obviously vary depending on how what is the complexity of the business logic we put it on the chain.
Yeah, okay, so actually bring up a really good point in that with tokenization, with that items become objects in a sense, and the contracts are important, but equally as important is the tokenization aspect, because the data is going to be resident within that token or user. For example, I'm going to pull up the second screen that Conor provided, which is basically sort of, how the flow might change. So in a centralized, on the left is the centralized, where you have users and platform. And on the right, maybe you have services. Conor, do you want to explain this a little bit more, and where, I guess, that explore a little bit more about how tokens and assets and contracts might work?
Yeah, and certainly Sudhir's points really kind of flow into this. He spoke about how you have fairly minimal logic in the smart contracts, and this is one of the the classic challenges that we've seen with some of the organisations we work with, where they start off with this big kind of traditional enterprise type system, and specifically this is one of our clients here, where they're thinking very much so in more traditional Web2 type ways of doing things. You have like this centralized API, and you do everything via that API, or their customers integrate via that API, instead of thinking about the opportunities to create those value-added services kind of on the boundaries of the system there. So if we can bring the slide back up, it just might illustrate it a little bit better, just as I mention it. But as Ken says, on the left, you have that traditional model with this platform in the center, but with the Web3 paradigm, it kind of splits. So you have these services, and you can think about each of those different services. There's opportunities there for organizations to create value-add services. It could be developer SDKs, it could be support-based services. It's kind of all those things that enable these people to work with this service, but without one entity having overarching control over it. And that's one of the key tenets there. That does take a lot of time to really make people appreciate it, because the business models are different as well to what they might be used to doing, that could be, say, heavily transaction based or API based in that regard.
Right. Well, also, to me, what the wow was to this was that these could be devices, these could be supply chain aspects. So, as Sushil, do you want to talk about sort of smart contracts and the nature of the items that you're tracking, and where the logic sort of is, and how you're structuring that?
Sure. So basically, or let me, kind of highlight some of the lessons that we have learned, in terms, especially in terms of the smart contracts, right? So we have been, it's an asset-based model that we have developed. So what that means is that every business object, it is created as an asset in the smart contract, right? So what we have seen over the years is that, the business logic may change. Right, and then smart contract, or the Solidity smart contracts by nature, they are tamper evident. What that means is, once you create it, you cannot modify the schema. If you modify the schema, you have to deploy a new contract, and by that you lose the older data. And to avoid this scenario, we went with the delegate proxy pattern. What it does is, it separates the contracts into two parts. One is the storage, and one is the functional contract. So even if your logic of the smart contract changes, you come up with the new functional contract, but your storage contract remains the same. You can just point your old storage contract to the new functional contract. That way, with the changing business logic over the years, you do not lose the older data, because the storage contract remains the same. So the delegate proxy pattern, which is available in Solidity, that's an important piece that we used when we did the design of the smart contracts. Right, so that basically enabled the backward compatibility of the contracts. Now, the second very important aspect is the data privacy. So we know in a standard supply chain, you will have many suppliers, many buyers, right? But I, as a buyer, I do not want to share the data of one supplier with the other supplier. So we used privacy groups and private smart contracts. So what that means is that every buyer created its own private contract with every supplier it used to work. That way we achieved data privacy, and the data segregation was achieved across the different suppliers. So that's also one of the important pieces.
Yeah, go ahead, keep going.
Sorry, one last thing basically that we adopted. Now, the third pattern we adopted was the contract indexing approach. So in Solidity, if you know that there's a limit to the maximum storage against a smart contract that you can do. I think it's around 60 million, and beyond that 60 million records, because of the complex Merkle tree structure, the minting and all gets very slow. So what we did is that, and because we are tracking each and every component, and the supply chain business, I think the millions of components are traded or purchased every year. So we used the indexing approach. So basically that had put a cap on the maximum number of records that we can store in a smart contract. And the moment you reach that cap, a new contract was automatically getting deployed, and the new records or the new data was coming in the new contract. So this contract indexing approach really helped us to scale the solution, to the volume of the business that big organizations like Microsoft, they do today.
Okay. So how are others handling privacy areas? Because I think that is a big question that people may have.
Yeah, so in our case, like privacy, of course, is important. Given the two networks that we have, Onyx Digital Assets Network and Link Network by Onyx, we leverage the privacy feature within Quorum, which is what I think, Sushil, you were referring to, private smart contracts and private transactions. At the same time, given that this is permissioned networks, leveraging some of the encryption at the same time, leveraging operational aspects or operational entitlement to some of the data set, we can manage the privacy aspect. But primarily using the privacy features of contracts and the transactions within Quorum at the moment.
Did you mention what you're doing asset tokenization? Can you explain a little bit more about that? I think there was a question I saw on the board about that. What assets? What type of assets?
Right. So asset in our case right now, we were using a repo, which is a repurchase agreement between two counterparties. And for the benefit of everyone else, a repurchase agreement is a seller gets into an agreement with a buyer that after a certain time and a certain price, it will buy back the same instrument or product at a certain price. We can do that in the current state or using existing rails. However, the logistics of moving and changing the ownership of those assets within a certain or a very short period of time with DVP and settlement is quite involved. And hence most of the assets most of those transactions are overnight. But with the tokenization and setting on the same ledger, we can do almost instant settlement and swapping between a cash and a collateral, which is the repo transaction, which is what we were doing earlier.
Awesome. So we've got a couple minutes left and just show 30 seconds each. Lessons learned, things that you wish you could do over, or any wisdom you want to impart, 1 or 2 items. So Conor, why don't you go first? Lessons learned, hard things you could have done over.
So I think a lot of the lessons I've already learned and so on. I just to do a brief plug, I shared in my book, the Blockchain Innovators Handbook. So I've tried to distill as much of the stuff in my mind into that, and it's only released sort of 3 months ago. So I guess that's my plug. And
that's it there, and they can see you. You've got a booth here, so they can see you. Visit you guys there. Sudhir, Sushil. I'm sorry, Sushil. Do you want to go?
Yeah, so quickly, I think one of the important lessons learned is that even though you're using a private permissioned platform, it's very important to keep in mind the carbon footprint of the whole solution, right? So what that means from a Quorum perspective is you can optimize the number of validators you're using, right? The distance between the validators, they really impact the minting time and the footprint. So that's an important aspect to be considered for any blockchain solution.
So it's performance as well as certainly the energy footprint.
Correct.
So you got to be concerned about the performance aspects as well. Okay, Sudhir, how do you want to lessons learned, things you would have done differently?
Yes, not underestimating the integration with existing ecosystems, because most of the tokenization at the moment we do actually tie back to the real world or digitized assets. Extremely important for us to have this integration with the existing ecosystem. That's number one. And second one is security, compliance, legal, and regulatory aspects. Do not underestimate that. That is involved in enterprise. because that's the most important thing that differs from public chain. And we have to, otherwise we won't be in the business.
Great, thanks. I'd love to have you back another time. I enjoyed this discussion. I know it was short, but I learned a lot, and I hope everybody else did. So thank you all to our panelists. Appreciate this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.